medical device regulation and notified bodies.
Hi, everyone. My name is Oliver Bisazza from MedTech Europe, the association representing the medical devices, diagnostics, and digital health industries in Europe. My presentation today is about the new EU Medical Devices Regulation, or MDR, with a focus on what it means for getting ready and on the fate of notified bodies. As we know, medical technologies are an incredibly diverse range of products, ranging from very sophisticated to very simple devices for preventing, monitoring, managing, and treating healthcare conditions. We estimate that there are at least 500,000 of such devices on the market today, and regulating their safety and performance is a special challenge because of how technologically diverse they are and how varied the level of risk they pose is to patients and users. But the legislation that tries to do this is the EU medical devices legislation. And the MDR, which is the new regulation published in 2017, is a big one. It replaces, as of 26th of May next year, former EU directives from the 1990s. And as you see on this screen, the new regulation is nearly twice as long in terms of length as that former directive. So it brings new details, new obligations, and special challenges that the regulated industry needs to get its head around and get ready for on time. While it is not a complete revolution of how medical devices are regulated in Europe, it does comprise a modernized and strengthened system with new requirements or new concepts introduced in very many respects. Some of them are mentioned on the screen here, such as simple things like labeling changes, which need to be managed within the company, to changes to the level of clinical evidence a manufacturer needs to bring to show really that a device works safely as intended, to brand new things like economic operator requirements across the supply chain, meaning not just obligations for the manufacturer, but also the importer, the authorized representative, the distributors, and so on. There's also a brand new database under preparation called UDAMED, which is a very large and ambitious project. And once it's ready, from May 2022 onwards, all actors, including the regulated industry, will need to regularly interface with this database to register devices and all sorts of other information. And there are many other changes too, including to notified bodies, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So while it is not a wholesale revolution of the regulatory framework for medical devices, the MDR is bringing not just more length, but a lot of novelty in terms of new obligations, more detailed obligations, and is really very important that everyone affected by this works early to get into full compliance. But you might ask, why was this level of overhaul needed in the first place? Why did we need a new regulation? Well, partially it was because there was a need to modernize the legislation. Compared to the early 1990s when the previous directives were made, there had been a need of becoming apparent over time to clarify which products really are medical devices and what risk category they should be in. Technology has evolved too, and interesting areas like cybersecurity, software, and artificial intelligence simply weren't the focus back in the early 1990s. And so the regulation has dedicated rules for those technologies too. And there was also an identified need to lay down requirements for traceability of devices in the European supply chains. So modernization was one area. There was also a need, let's be frank, to tighten the system in terms of the strictness of the obligations to increase trust in how we regulate medical devices in the EU. Some of the obligations related to transparency about the devices that are on the market and the evidence the manufacturer has that those products are safe and work well were important examples of this. And last but not least, there was a real need identified to strengthen the notified body system. Notified bodies are the gatekeepers of this legislation. They assess manufacturers' compliance with the legislation, and it was really important to ensure that they were operating to very high levels of competence and impartiality. And to be very clear, there were some negative experiences in the past with some substandard notified bodies. So overhauling the notified body system was seen as essential to get rid of some of the bad apples and leave behind only the organizations which were genuinely competent to do their duties. Now, although this change brings lots of new obligations and regulatory burden for industry, we support this overhaul. We think it was necessary to modernize, we think it was necessary to build trust, and we absolutely agree it was needed to strengthen the notified body system. And despite the workload it brings to us as manufacturers, we are investing heavily to comply on time, despite the challenges it brings. But let's talk about one special challenge, which is notified bodies, because it really is one of the biggest areas to manage as we transition to May 2021. Notified bodies are organizations that are designated and supervised by the national governments of the EU member states. They receive their license to operate from the EU member states, and it is their role to assess the conformity of manufacturers before most devices are brought to market. Some of them are public sector, some of them are private sector, but whatever they are, they must operate in a non-discriminatory, transparent, neutral, independent, and impartial way. And it is through designation and supervision by the member states that this is ensured. What do? Well, they assess independently whether our members, medical device manufacturers, have conformed with the law. They audit us, they assess our product files, and they check our quality systems. And if we do not pass muster as the regulated industry, notified bodies can and will hold back the certificates we need to commercialize device. And they have a very targeted role. Notified bodies can do these important activities because they claim and are demonstrated to have real competence in the technologies that they oversee. So they are notified and designated for a very specific product scope. And this is to ensure that medical technologies, which again can vary enormously in terms of science and design, are overseen and checked by organizations who are genuinely competent and expert in those technologies. And when a notified body has been involved in the conformity assessment of the device labeling needs not only the famous CE marking, but it also needs, underneath that, the number identifying the notified body that was involved. Now, what's really challenging with notified bodies is that they are needed to certify a large number of medical devices in Europe, but the number of notified bodies in Europe has been going down. Before 2012, we had nearly 90 notified bodies in Europe, and now we're down to 56. This is partially because of the ongoing efforts to really strengthen the system and make sure that only genuinely competent and independent notified bodies operate. But there has been a reduction. And those 56 notified bodies, if they want to remain operational under the MDR, they need to apply for designation and they need to be designated before they can certify devices. 46 organizations out of the 56 we have today are understood to have applied, but as of now, only 17 have passed the very long and rigorous process, meaning that only a fraction of today's notified bodies are currently allowed to certify devices according to the MDR. And while this number will inevitably go up over time, it does mean that there is a limited certification capacity in Europe right now to transition to the MDR. So it's really, really important to not only have your own house in order as a manufacturer and to have complied with the obligations, but to have access to a notified body who can check your conformity and issue you the certificates you need to sell in Europe. And finally, there's a special consideration for the British notified bodies, because after Brexit, after the 1st of January 2021, it'll no longer be possible for the 4 UK notified bodies listed on the screen to continue operating in Europe. And so at least 2 of these, BSI and SGS, have contingency plans. They have set up branches or had existing branches in the EU 27 member states, and they've transferred over a lot of their capacity to keep operating. In the case of BSI, they've already been notified under the MDR back in November 2019. SGS is still awaiting their designation. And so if you work with one of these notified bodies or the other, you may or may not be able to keep moving ahead right now with getting your devices certified. So all this is important because not only because the British notified bodies can no longer operate out of the UK, it's also important because historically the British notified bodies were very, very impactful. Together, they are estimated to have accounted for nearly a third, at least, of Europe's certification capacity for medical devices. And their disappearance adds to the concerns that there's not enough notified body availability out there right now. Thankfully, they have contingency plans in at least 2 cases. Um, and I have to say that by now, although there were always concerns about Brexit, we understand most big manufacturers who worked with British notified bodies in the past have by now switched to ones based in the EU 27. So is it a challenge? Yes, and it happened in the middle of our transition period, but the understanding by now is that most affected manufacturers have been able to find a backup plan. I hope this presentation has been interesting for you. I'm available to answer your questions bilaterally if you want to reach out to me, and thanks a lot for having invited MedTech Europe to this presentation.